Welcome, everyone. I'm going to wait a couple minutes while everyone filters in, but we'll get started shortly. So welcome. As we talk today about artwork that recontextualizes our national symbolism and calls attention to historical injustice, I think it's particularly important that we start with the violent history of dispossession, enslavement, and dispersal of Indigenous communities. So I want to give everyone a moment to read this and take in these words. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Madeleine Day Delpha, and I'm the Assistant Director of Programs and Community Engagement at the Rose Art Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome my co-facilitator for today's talk, Raj. Raj, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Madeleine. My name is Rajesh Sampath. Rajesh is my full name. I'm on the faculty at the Heller School for Social Policy Management, and I do occasional teaching in the humanities and in arts and sciences. And I've been at Brandeis now for 12 years.
Great. Well, Raj, I'm so excited to have the opportunity to speak with you more about this artwork. I should mention too that we have closed captioning available. So if you need that, please hit the button at the bottom of your screen. So let's jump right in with our first piece. I want to preface this by saying that most of these works are not in the permanent collection of the Rose Art Museum, but I will point out the works that are in our collection as we go. I think this talk provides great context for the pieces that are in our collection. So I want to start with this piece, Three Flags by Jasper Johns. Three Flags is an encaustic painting that provokes introspection from the viewer. So Johns believes that the flag was seen but not looked at, not examined. And encaustic paintings are created by mixing pigment with hot wax, and the hot wax dries very quickly. So it draws attention to each mark and each brushstroke. And you can see there's a lot of texture in this painting, even though the lines and forms are very precise. And so by using a highly recognizable, indeed very ubiquitous image, Johns is asking us to contemplate not just the flag and its symbolism, but also the very nature of painting itself. So are these flags or are these paintings of flags? Is this a reproduction or is this something wholly original? And Johns says, using the design of the American flag took care of a great deal for me because I didn't have to design it. So I went on to similar things like targets, things that the mind already knows, that gave me room to work on other levels. And we can see Johns is quite literally working on other levels here because we have three different levels of flags. And this trio of flags projects out towards the viewer in a subversion of traditional perspective. So traditionally things get smaller as they get further away, but here they're getting smaller as they get closer to us. So this painting is representational, but it uses the vocabulary of abstraction. It's conceptual, but it's also painterly. And the context of this piece is really the global prominence of American art and American culture during the post-war era. And Johns is making a very unmistakably American art here. And by reproducing such a recognizable and formally prescribed object, Johns is questioning the very nature of art and iconography. So I wanted to use this piece as a jumping off point to examine contemporary artists' use of American patriotic symbols to not only interrogate, but also recontextualize American mythology, to challenge ideas about free expression, and to even have a direct impact on laws about the limits of that expression. So Three Flags really gets at this central question. Are they flags or are they a painting of flags? Are flags important as physical objects themselves or are they symbols? And does this physical manifestation of this symbol impact its meaning? And they sound very heady, but these are very important questions that have very real legal and political implications, as we'll see. So Raj, when we talked earlier, you had an interesting take on the trio flags and how they seem to be building on each other. And I'd love for you to share that again.
Well, thank you, Madeleine. And if I didn't do this earlier, I want to thank you for the invitation to join you in this conversation. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. You know, when I first saw this, I thought to myself, you might be inclined to think that you see the 48 or 50 stars, but there's actually more. And the depth perception here is that the smaller flag that you would in the center, you would think might be at the top, sitting on the next level. And then, of course, the bigger flag is the foundation. Or it could be the inverse, which is you're kind of telescoping in, and maybe perhaps we're seeing into the depths of the flag, the smaller piece. And how does that relate to the American historical context? Well, it's right after desegregation and before the civil rights movement, so the 60s and the civil rights legislation. So depending on your perspective today, you know, some people argue, are we talking about an expansion of freedom for racial minorities, or are we talking about a deterioration and a structural kind of understanding of how racism persists, which is what critical race theory tries to articulate. So I was thinking about that, but to get back to your original question, the flag is a symbol of myth, a political symbol of myth. It's incarnate, and it stands for more than what it means, because it sort of creates our relationship to patriotically some kind of American identity. But as you know, we've talked about this, and we'll get into it more, which is where is the role of social movements and radical critique when it comes to questioning that symbol, because it's not inclusive, and in fact, for some, maybe a symbol of oppression. And then what is the reaction politically and legislatively and judicially, all the way up to the Supreme Court, on the limits of free expression? So I know we'll get there, but my first take is that I don't know what we're seeing. It is multidimensional. It may or may not be the flag for some, or maybe for others.
And that's really interesting, because if we go to this next piece, this is a piece by Faith Ringgold, and I see it very much as a response to Jasper Johns. Faith Ringgold and Jasper Johns, our contemporaries, are actually born in the same year. And I want to think about what you said and what Johns says about the flag, you know, that it gives him this room to work on other levels as an artist, and contrast that, as you said, with what an artist from a very different background, Faith Ringgold, says about the flag. She says, the flag is the only truly subversive and revolutionary abstraction one can paint. So this painting is part of Faith Ringgold's American People series, in which Ringgold, who is a Black woman artist, and she's one of my favorite artists, she's depicting the racial and political divides of the 1960s. So here we have three figures linking arms. We have a Black man, a white woman, and a white man, and they're overlaid with this American flag that's splattered in blood. And the African-American man is holding his hand over his heart, which is splurting blood. So he's both covering this wound, stemming the bleeding, but he's also pledging allegiance to the flag. And he holds a knife in his other hand. So this painting was made amidst, you know, the very violent protests of the American Civil Rights Movement and the anti-war movements. And, you know, this African-American figure is fighting for his life and for his freedom, while we have these other two figures that are, you know, unharmed. And Ringgold says, you know, Ringgold she's showing us very literally who is protected by American freedoms and who is not. And she says, we thought of the American flag as our symbol of freedom, but we were losing our freedoms in the 1960s. All the blood laying all over the sidewalk, nothing about it in the papers. I mean, silence like it didn't happen. It is very difficult to paint blood because you feel like you are bleeding. The flag was bleeding and may still be. So, Raj, I would love to hear your reaction to this painting.
Well, that was such an amazing distillation that you just provided, Madeleine, to introduce the piece. And you had to see the blood spots throughout. But before I get into it, for those of us that might remember the 2000 election of President Barack Obama, that was it 10 or 12, the campaign, part of the campaign was to show these photographs of him where he's sort of blue and red as a unifier, but a transcendent figure too, because first person of color to actually win the office. But to take it back to something earlier, when I guess he might have been a kid, but this great tumultuous time, and how historiographically and historically we're taught the history of interpretations of how we're supposed to relate to the 60s. But from the BIPOC lens, yes, he's wounded. You might see him as the aggressor, compared to the way the white male figure, who's the bigger figure and the most prominent, because perhaps he's closer to the center or takes up more of the space with the red and white stripes. And not to minimize, but even though the painting does this intentionally, minimize the stature of the woman, not because she's shorter, but where are we with regard to gender justice at this period, which may or may not be overshadowed by the civil rights movements, and foreshadowing, of course, 50 years later, the toppling of row that we see today in the horrific times that we're going through. But you do see this sort of like solidity of the white male power, and then how we're supposed to interpret beneath the stars both the bleeding figure of the Black man, but the poignancy of the suffering, and how has that been reproduced over time across different generations to our time? And then does this piece serve as a source of inspiration for us to be, first of all, remind ourselves of how long it took to start the battle, start the fight, and then the victories that might have been seen in the 1960s with regard to civil rights, but then where are we today? So it's this vertigo we have between progress, but also regress.
And it's interesting because this painting is from 1967, and the same year that this painting was made in 1967, as I mentioned, there is quite a lot of opposition to the Vietnam War during this time. And that same year, Stephen Radich, who's a New York art dealer, was actually sentenced to jail for showing work by an artist who had created flag-based artworks to protest the Vietnam War. And this was in violation of the New York state flag desecration law. And Radich was sentenced to 60 days in jail, and he had to pay a $500 fine. So we can see that, the flag has become very politicized during this time. And we see that, artists are using it not just to push the boundaries of representation, as Johns does, but it's also being used as a political tool to push the boundaries of what can be expressed and what can be exhibited, and to convene these conversations about civil rights, about Vietnam, about, as you say, the role of women as well. And they're trying to create a space for conversation about American patriotism. And at this time, so many people felt that not only were they not kind of receiving these promised American freedoms, but also that the flag was being used as a symbol in support of a war that they opposed. And I think Faith Ringgold is a really important part of these conversations. She's an artist, but also an activist. Her activism centered around Black artist representation and women's artist representation in cultural spaces. In the 70s, she starts making story quilts, and she's an important part about the conversation about fine arts versus craft, and the feminist art movement. So she really is a very extraordinary figure in terms of, both her art and her activism. But in response to Stephen Radich, the gallerist that I mentioned, and in response to his arrest, Faith Ringgold, along with two other artists, John Hendricks and Jean Touche, they're co-founders of the Guerrilla Art and Action Group, they organized an exhibition called the People's Flag Show. And Faith Ringgold designed the poster for this show. It was at Judson Memorial Church in New York in Greenwich Village in November 1970. And Ringgold, Hendricks, and Touche issue an open call for artwork that pushed the boundary of these anti-desecration laws. So it's organized in response to what happened with Stephen Radich's arrest, but more broadly, the federal flag desecration law of 1968, which said that whoever knowingly casts contempt upon any flag of the United States by publicly mutilating, defacing, defiling, burning, or trampling upon it shall be fined not more than $1,000 or imprisoned for not more than a year or both. So the text of this poster, I should say, was written by Ringgold's daughter, Michelle Wallace, and works in this exhibition included a performance piece in which artists burned flags together with bones and rotten meat while Jean Touche read the Declaration of War. And the burned remains of this flesh and the flag were placed in the sanctuary of the church. So this is very much referencing sort of the carnage and destruction of Vietnam. Abby Hoffman spoke while wearing an American flag shirt. He had this I'd say it's very much like the kind of shirt that we saw Garth Brooks wearing in the 1990s, very uncontroversially. But Abby Hoffman had been arrested for wearing this shirt during a hearing of the House Un-American Activities Subcommittee in 1968. So Abby Hoffman's there, and there's that kind of demonstrates that there's this concerted effort at this time to, really suppress any kind of political dissent and investigate it and call it un-American. Yvonne Rainer and other dancers performed nude, draped in flags. So this exhibition was, it was really meant to be provocative. It was, quite literally incendiary because they were burning flags. And, they set out to directly challenge these flag desecration laws, and it worked. The exhibition was closed one day early by the Attorney General of New York. And John Hendricks, John Touche, and Faith Ringgold became known as the Judson Three. They were arrested and charged with desecration of the US flag. So, Raj, I'm interested to hear your reaction to this turmoil of the late 1960s and the early 70s and the implications on free speech and free expression during that time.
Thank you, Madeleine. Yes, I mean, we do always we look at the data, the painting, and we think about the historical context, which I'll talk about in a second. But, the philosophical kind of question here, I think, on the table is what we'll see over time in terms of what the judiciary will finally decide on the right of free expression, First Amendment protecting flag burning, but we're not there yet. That's 1989. But prior to that, I'm thinking of two texts, two objects, one a book and one an object of material to represent a symbol, is the flag. The Bible and the flag, if you're going to desacralize those two, is taking great risk, whether it's a political statement or artistic statement or both. But it was Derek Bell in 1972 who wrote Race, Racism, and the American Law. It's the first textbook on race by a person of color, so few and far in between then, and even now at the top law schools, but certainly back then, which then launched a generation later, 2 decades later, the critical race theorists have founded the movement in the 90s. But he pointed out in his chapter on free expression that it appears to be equal. The 14th Amendment, equal opportunity, equal protection, to protect the First Amendment, freedom to the freedom of expression. It doesn't work that way. It depends on who's doing the speaking. So free expression is protected for the dominant group and for the longest time white men to protest whatever, for example, anti-war. But what happens when people of color and women then and LGBTQ are engaged in the protests? So we got to look at this asymmetry within free speech itself. But the larger issue again is, in a creative democratic possibility, which is the American system versus, let's say, other modern Western democracies that have their own thresholds for blasphemy and free speech. I don't want to get into the complexity of different Western European contexts, but here you would think that we're tending towards maximum individual expression and artistic expression to even desecrate something like the flag and make that the artistic, kind of creation or statement. So there's the fundamental defense of that right. On the other hand, that's one hand. On the other hand, to where does the moral threshold arise in society that creates the shock factor that then creates this reactionary movement to the individual artistic act? So in other words, so many artists, I would imagine artists who are minoritized and intersectionally minoritized are the ones that are painted as the aggressors against the mainstream opinion about the limits of artistic free expression, when in fact they're speaking from, first of all, the artistic space. So how are we supposed to think about that? But also the position of suffering, which is real and therefore political.
Right.
So it's a roundabout way of saying that there are two sides to free expression, and it's asymmetrical because the folks of color and the minoritized groups take greater risk in many respects when it comes to artistic creation.
And are very much holding America to its founding ideals.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. So that is actually a perfect segue to our next piece. This is called "What is the Proper Way to Display the U.S. Flag?" It's from 1989. It's by an artist named Dred Scott. Dred Scott is an African-American conceptual artist, and his chosen name, of course, references the historical figure Dred Scott, who was an enslaved Black man who sued the government for his freedom in 1846, and who the Supreme Court ultimately in 1857 ruled did not have the right to sue because he was not considered a citizen in what is widely considered to be the worst decision of the United States Supreme Court. I think it's probably up there as the worst. So the artist Dred Scott takes Dred Scott's name and he adds an A. So his name is spelled D-E-D-R-E-A-D. So now we have this feeling of dread. And also at the time, the artist had dreadlocks. And he said that, at the time, other people he knew who had dreadlocks became known as like Jimmy Dread or Steve Dread. And so he became Dred Scott. But he also says, he's quite intentionally referencing Dred Scott. And he says, while there have been major changes in America since that 1857 Supreme Court case, the racism and exploitation that led to the ruling, which included the words to the effect of there are no rights that a Black person has that a white man is bound to respect, hasn't changed much. The form of racism has changed, but the basic position of Black people in the society and the rationale for it have remained constant. I wanted people to have a reminder of this. So Dred Scott does this piece as a 23-year-old art student. He exhibits it at the Art Institute of Chicago as part of an exhibition that's organized by the Black Student Association. The piece features a flag on the ground along with a photo montage and a notebook where visitors could write their responses, likely standing on the flag. In order to write a response in this book, you pretty much have to be standing on the flag. And this photo montage, requires close looking in order to really figure out what's happening in it. So it really does kind of invite the viewers to stand on the flag in order to view the piece. And at the top, we have South Korean protesters burning a flag in opposition to the ongoing military presence in South Korea and also pressure to open their domestic markets to foreign goods. And here at the bottom, we have pictures of these flag draped coffins that are holding the bodies of soldiers coming home from Vietnam. And photos like this of military coffins coming home have been censored by the US government at various moments in our history. So reproducing this image here is quite provocative. And the piece is literally asking us, what is the proper way to display the flag? So is it in protest to US imperialism? Is it draped over the bodies of these soldiers who died in Vietnam? But more than that, it's inviting dialogue in response to this question. It's asking visitors to engage and respond to this question. And I have a detail here that shows some of these responses. So what was the response to this piece? Well, it was pretty dramatic. A veterans group protested outside the school and chanted, "The flag and the artist, hang them both high." The school received bomb threats. The staff received death threats. The following year, the school's funding was cut from $130,000 to $1. The president of the United States at the time, George H.W. Bush, commented on the work and said he thought it was disgraceful. The United States Congress denounced it and passed legislation to protect the Flag Protection Act of 1989, which criminalized the conduct of anyone who knowingly mutilates, defiles, defaces, burns, maintains on the floor or ground, or tramples upon the United States flag. And so this, was a student exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago that got this very, very national response. And so Dred Scott and others defied this law, this Flag Protection Act of 1989, by burning flags on the steps of the US Capitol. So the other people that burned the flag along with Dred Scott were Gregory Lee Johnson, who is the defendant in another flag burning case, Texas v. Johnson, Sean Eichmann, who is an artist and a member of the Coalition Opposed to Censorship in the Arts, and David Bullock, who's a Vietnam veteran. So this led to a landmark Supreme Court decision that upholds the legality of burning American flags as free expression. And the decision is called US v. Eichmann et al. From 1990. And the ruling reads in part, "The mere destruction or disfigurement of a symbol's physical manifestation does not diminish or otherwise affect the symbol itself." So not only are we seeing the issues raised by the Judson Three play out here, but we're also seeing an answer to the question posed by Jasper Johns. Is the flag an object or is it a symbol? Well, the Supreme Court rules that the physical object is not the symbol itself. The destruction or disfigurement of a physical manifestation does not diminish or otherwise affect the symbol itself. So I think that's very interesting that this question posed by Jasper Johns is now being answered by the US Supreme Court. But also, to speak to what you've been saying, Raj, the backlash to Dred Scott's artwork, further invites us to consider the impulse to protect an American symbol over its citizens, to protect an American symbol over the freedom of speech, over artistic expression. And it's inviting us to wonder, whether nationalist symbols can ever truly be democratic. And so, Raj, I'm interested to hear your take because, now a few times we've seen these anti-desecration laws or these flag protection acts being challenged by artists, and, ultimately the free expression is upheld. But as you brought up, it's very interesting to see whose speech is being challenged here.
This piece and this whole conversation here on Dred Scott's work, 1989, in that context, just gets my head spinning because I don't even know where to begin. I first want to acknowledge what you'd said earlier, and thank you again, another wonderful distillation and setting up the context, that Dred Scott, the play on dread, anxiety, angst, and then of course the historic figure of Dred Scott in the 19th century, that would ultimately lead to segregation and after Reconstruction. This is a pivotal period. It's the end of the Cold War, but it's also the transition to the new American Empire, the wars in the Middle East, long before 9/11. And so to locate it there where, can we now use the so-called disparagement or denigration of the flag as an act of social protest and free expression on the responsibility of America, but coming from a person of color, and to see that kind of backlash, we're talking about the flag here. And I'm thinking today, we can protest the Super Bowl at halftime and maybe not stand up for the national anthem without repercussion. I mean, without pure impunity. There are repercussions. There are massive debates about Black athletes, particularly, or white athletes that would ally in terms of not standing up for the anthem. We can question the historical veracity of July the 4th. I'm trying to think of something that more sacred than the flag, the origin of the country, when we think of the movement to support Juneteenth. But back then, why the reaction and the nuance of the Supreme Court decision, from what I remember, Texas v. Johnson, is this is an act of free expression. You may not like it. You could be morally aghast at the act, but in defense of the First Amendment, which is the First Amendment of the whole set of rights, because from that flows everything else, you may not like it, but you shouldn't, first of all, leave it up to the courts to decide whether it's the physicality or the symbol. They made that decision, but it's not for the court to decide what needs to be protected. That should be done in the legislature. But it was interesting to see how they were teetering even in the decision, that it could have gone perhaps the other way. But they did ultimately veer towards free expression. But getting back to my previous point, free expression by and for whom? Mm-hmm. And who takes the greatest amount of risk? And I think that, what he was suggesting in terms of my interpretation, I don't know if you want to go back to the actual standing above the flag. Yeah, I mean, the first of all, the clinical and tranquil nature of this, when it first appears to you, if you can tune out the fact, which is hard, that the flag is on the floor, maybe it's just a piece of rug, you're drawn into what you're supposed to do, which is go right to the front, maybe engage in some active writing in the book. And then only later may you realize, depending upon who you are, that you're standing on the flag. So, I see great, what's the word here? I don't want to say innocence, but do we make that mental shift? Not just, we're not going to ruin the symbol or the meaning by destroying the object or denigrating the object, but can we even blanket out the fact that the object can only appear in one way and for one purpose? It's still there, but depending on your perspective, it can be seen as the ground that we stand on. That's a total inversion. I'm not saying that would have been Dred Scott's defense, but it does suggest that we may be colorblind, a lot of us today. We don't want to think critically. I'm not that way. I happen to think that the context of our times, even now, suggests that when artists of color and, let's say, trans folks are fighting for trans rights and queer rights, that when you take that extra leap and challenge the mainstream, that you do so with great risk, and that there is, oftentimes great backlash, and not from what you would think are the usual suspects, which would be the conservative or the religious right. It's in many respects the white majority, even on the liberal side.
And it's
so, for
interesting.
example, mainstream Democrats like Biden.
Well, it's interesting because, the title of this talk is The Critical Patriot. And in many ways, I see this as a very patriotic piece of art, because Dred Scott is asking us to think about these things, to grapple with the flag. What does the flag mean? How is the U.S. viewed abroad? How do we feel about that? He's inviting this response. He's creating a space for that discussion, which to me is, quite patriotic and quite American in some ways. And there's one more thing I want to point out about this piece. I read dozens and dozens of articles about this piece because I'm truly a nerd that will do that. And I read, contemporary accounts about this in the Chicago Tribune. I even read a PhD dissertation about this piece. And every single piece describes this photo montage as Korean protesters burning an American flag, but it's not an American flag. These are hexagrams. This isn't an American flag. And I have a few theories on why this could be and what this could mean. I don't know for sure. And if we have anyone on the call who's a 20th century Korean history expert, I would actually love to talk to you about this. But I wanted to point it out because I think it perfectly encapsulates what Jasper John says about the flag, that it's seen but not looked at. And that so many people look at this and just immediately assume that this is a faithful reproduction of American flag, but it's actually not. And that we often don't take the time to stop it. I probably looked at this photo montage 15 times before I realized, oh, this is actually different. And so I think that, what Dred Scott is inviting us to do is actually very important, to stop and really think about it, look at it, consider it carefully. And, if I were able to get a coffee with Dred Scott, I would absolutely ask him about where he found this photograph and if he intentionally chose that photograph for that reason, or what exactly is going on there. So it's a very rich piece for discussion. And I wanted to bring us to another artist who's working around the same time of this Eichmann decision, Erica Rothenberg. This piece is in the Roses collection. Rothenberg is born in New York, and she attends the University of Chicago, where she takes part in a student protest that takes over an administration building, and she's suspended. And the way she tells the story is that she's told that she can return if she apologizes, but she doesn't apologize. And instead she goes to UC Berkeley and she continues studying art and activism. And after Berkeley, she moves back to New York and she gets a job at McCann Erickson, which, if you watched Mad Men, like I did, you know that McCann Erickson is a global advertising agency that did the iconic I'd like to buy the world a Coke ad. And Erica Rothenberg, she ends up becoming the first female art director at McCann Erickson. So she's a very interesting figure already. And I love this because I actually found an article where she talks about working at McCann Erickson and one of her failed Coke pitches. And her pitch is a riff on Marx's Communist Manifesto. And the pitch goes, "Workers of the world, refresh, overthrow the bondage of parched throats, gain control of the means of refreshment with the great taste of Coca-Cola. Coke's clear, crisp taste has soothed more thirsty workers than any other soft drink since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Workers of the world, refresh. You've got nothing to lose but your thirst," which I think that's hilarious. And I truly, truly wish that had been dramatized on Mad Men. But anyway, she ends up leaving McCann Erickson in the 70s so that she can focus on her own artwork. But it's important because I think she's very much drawing on her background in advertising, and she's using this very commercial style to create, very subversive political art. And her work, it pushes boundaries, but it's also funny. We can see how funny she is. And she's using humor and the language of commercialism to make what she calls a skewed portrait of America. And she's really calling attention to the gap between appearance and reality in America. So this piece is from Rothenberg's solo show at the New Museum. And the solo show is called Have You Attacked America Today? And Marcia Tucker, who was the founding director of the New Museum, said it was the most controversial exhibition that the museum ever mounted. It was installed, we can see in this kind of storefront window that was smashed twice during the exhibition. And you can see here, here's the flag burning kit. And then we have this very sort of commercial, they look like they're right from an advertisement couple, but you can see they're burning the flag. It's pretty subtle. And then we have these freedom of expression drugs. We have this anti-apathy ointment. We have protest pills, and we have offend mouthwash, guaranteed to make you say the most awful things. She has this sort of alternative lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner, sort of pointing out some of the hypocrisy she sees in America. And then we have this celebrity simulator podium for politicians. And so, you know, I should mention that the part of the context of this piece and of Dred Scott's piece is that the 1980s were what the Los Angeles Times described in 1989 as a watershed moment for censorship. So Christian religious lobbies like the American Family Association and Morality and Media objected to television shows and radio programs. There was a debate about censorship in music. And quite famously, the photographs of Robert Mapplethorpe and Andre Serrano, you know, caused controversy, and the artists had, you know, variously National Endowment for the Arts funding cut. You know, Mapplethorpe had an exhibition canceled. Senator Jesse Helms sponsored a bill which prevented the NEA from using funds to, and this is a quote, promote, disseminate, or produce obscene or indecent materials, including but not limited to depictions of sadomasochism, homoeroticism, the exploitation of children, or individuals engaged in sex acts, or material which denigrates the objects or beliefs of the adherents of a particular religion or non-religion. So this is very much, you know, culture wars that sort of precede our current culture wars. And artists are very much under attack. You know, free expression is under attack. And so with Dred Scott and Erica Rothenberg, you know, we have two sort of very different responses to this coming in the same year, but they're very different tonally. And Raj, I'm interested to hear what you think about the tone of this artwork, because it uses this very sort of optimistic, humorous tone.
Well, Erica Rothenberg's, it's what a boundary spanner and crosser to go into the private sector and to invoke Marx. But then coming back to Marx and the chapter on the commodity fetish, which is one of the outstanding features of a commodity in any capitalist system, is this attribution of a fetish to it. It creates a supersensory kind of aura to it, which is what art's supposed to do. So when art gets commodified and commercialized, that people can debate that. But she's doing this intentionally as a form of critique, which is, I think, brilliant. But to take it back to the time period again, I mean, on the one hand, we're going to see the dawning of slow-moving judicial and legislative change, but they're good. Planned Parenthood would be the early 90s, the American Disabilities Act. But you're reminding us that the reaction after the end of the Cold War, and presumably before Clinton, the closing of this Reagan era, is the religious right, and they're like in this totalitarian frenzy to get everyone into this moral, to envelop everyone in this moral view. And here art is pushing the limits as to both this time period in terms of, let's say, the private sector involved in the production of content, but then the appropriation of that process for an artistic statement, and then the testing the boundaries of free expression. Like, why couldn't this be seen? On the one hand, it's very much a product of America at the time. On the other hand, it gets the reaction that you mentioned, because if this was the most controversial, and to us looking back, it looks like, well, partially entertaining, but and very clever in terms of what the sequence that you'd mentioned in terms of the different products. But overall, it's hard. I was a kid back then, and maybe others on the call could give us more of a perspective of how they see that, the cultural wars then versus what we, as you said, are debating today. But I think, first of all, here I am. I'm for a loss for words. I think the piece is amazing. There's something about it, this Lego-like quality of, like a child, you're drawn to it. And yet then the double consciousness that invokes some Du Bois here sinks in, where you're not this kid that's experiencing the first act of trauma. This is a profound statement of the pathology of America and what's to come. So it's very foreboding in that way.
And it's interesting to think in 1989, she's saying, have you attacked America today? I can only imagine how controversial this piece would have been, in New York after September 11th, of course.
Yeah.
She's anticipating sort of the language that's going to be used, 20 years later. It's very interesting.
Jesse Helms' philosophy and a young George Bush Jr., yet to become president. That's another story we can.
Well, I'll take us ahead to our next era of suppression of political dissent. This is an installation by an artist named June Clark. June Clark is an African-American artist who grew up in Harlem, and she moved to Canada in 1968 so her husband could avoid the draft. So again, we're very much still grappling with the legacy of the Vietnam War. And she describes leaving the country as a rupture. If you think about the year 1968, it's such an intense year in American history. It's really the height of the political unrest of the 60s, and it's very personally disruptive for her. And she describes her artistic practice as a meditation and a way for her to process things. So her 2020 exhibition, Unrequited Love, presented American flag-based artworks that she had been working on for a span of more than 20 years, mirroring the erosion of democratic norms over that same period of time. And the exhibition title, Unrequited Love, refers to loving something that doesn't love you in return. So it's very much referencing America's history of racism that continues to this day, through its sometimes brutal mistreatment of its citizens, particularly its Black citizens, particularly Black women. And we'll look closely at one piece from this exhibition. This is Moral Disengagement. And this piece was made between 2014 and 2017. So it features an American flag that has unraveled almost completely. There's a rusty barbed wire cross finial. And this piece really evokes the turmoil during the lead up to the 2016 election of Donald Trump and its immediate aftermath, and this rise of this new brand of Christian nationalism and white supremacy, one that reached, the highest levels of government. And Clark's flags, you can feel when you look at them, they're really they're expressions of love and dismay. And, they haven't been desecrated. You don't get that sense from them. I get the sense that that this is an act of grief and this is an act of catharsis. They're very meticulous and careful. And she says, she talks about this. She says, as a child, my heart would become full whenever I saw the flag waving in the breeze. I was proud. And it was my understanding that all who saw our flag could and should only love it as citizens. And if not of our country, envy those who were protected by it. I was taught that all citizens under this flag would enjoy all the rights and freedoms under the Constitution. I left the United States in 1968, not because of the country or the soil, which I loved, but because of the powers that were at the time. However, through my art practice, I began to try and decipher exactly what my relation to the flag had become. As one is confused when a lover turns on one for no apparent reason, I began trying to make flags. And Raj, it's interesting because, when we first discussed these works, you saw this exhibition and you brought up Colin Kaepernick right away. And this exhibition was actually dedicated to Colin Kaepernick. And I'm wondering about your perspective on this very contemporary conversation around race and free expression, and whether you think it's changed in any way since the conversation of the 1960s and then the conversation of the late 1980s.
Well, at the end of the previous piece that you'd shared, Madeleine, the question arose as to this renewed patriotism that would come from 9/11, which actually happened as we saw it, but then to have the exhaustion of the 20 years of war and long before the lead up to 2016, people might recall, and especially those of us in higher ed, that during the re-election of President Obama in the second term, the backlash had begun in terms of the statements about the end of the white establishment and America is diversifying now way beyond recognition and we're losing all of our values, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the beginnings of the statement of what would then become the full-blown white nationalism that we'd see with the Trump movement, the populist movement. That's only one aspect of it. I'm not saying the entire Trump movement is just about that, but it was those student movements on campuses where students of color, particularly Black students and Latinx students, most underrepresented groups, both undergrad and graduate, trying to draw attentions between the internal struggles that people have within the academy vis-a-vis the outside world, which was the Black Lives Matter movement in response to the police shootings. And so to see, that's sort of the historical backdrop, but what we see here is not desecration or burning or even abandonment. What we see is a withering and sort of an atrophy, but that the tension, the unrequited love, as you mentioned, is this commitment to the identity. But what identity? What's left of the identity? What identity was there from the beginning that we were primordially excluded from as folks of color? But then to see the crucifix as compassion and love and forgiveness, so catharsis was a perfect way to put it. I think it's a release of this sort of accumulated trauma and the sort of racial battle fatigue. It's the exhaustion. And I do this in my classes. I say, okay, you want to talk about 1894 segregation, and then you want to talk about Du Bois, 1905, Souls of Black Folk, and the genius of Black intellectual, musical, and artistic traditions of the 20th century, and then Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in the 1960s. Look at this tremendous history that puts into question the sanctity of what we want to value as our genius as Americans. Because for me, when I look at the Black history, I see the condition of possibility of even talking about what matters the most, to sound like a philosopher for a second. But you fast forward to today, as you said, the very fact that a movement has to state something more fundamental than the Constitution or the flag, that life matters, that's supposed to be a religious or moral commandment, that, to say that Black lives matter in the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, after 60, 70 years of fighting for rights and equality. The piece shows me the tension between the pursuit of pure equality and liberty and now a statement about the meaning of life itself, which are the times we're living in now, that the nihilism that can set in if we, as Derek Bell himself said, that racism is permanent. He wasn't being fatalistic. He wasn't just being realistic either. He wants the white majority to understand the profound nature of that statement when you talk about the endurance of racial oppression. And what will it take then to finally break it? So I situate the piece between all these different epochs, but most specifically that this is both a commitment to, do you want to call it patriotic? Yes, I would. But certainly a commitment to the love of one's country or place or space. On the other hand, the beleaguering kind of this feeling of exhaustion, that we're still in this moment fighting for something as fundamental as the right to live.
Yeah, and I'm so moved by this piece because you can really see that it is this meditative catharsis for her. And to me, that's such an important part of what art does. It's not just a way of starting conversations, which it certainly is. And I think this really is a very skillfully done illustration of that conversation, but it's also it also is artists make art for themselves. They make art as a way to work through things. And to me, it's lovely to get to see such a concrete example of that, of working on these flags for over 20 years, sort of between other art pieces. She keeps returning to this flag over and over again as a way to sort of grapple with this rupture that happened in her life. I find it, very, very poignant and very moving. But I wanted to end with, one last piece. I kind of wanted to end on a bit of an uplifting note, which I hope this does. Here we have We the People by Jan Vo. It's another piece that, like Three Flags, like the first piece that we saw, it faithfully reproduces a ubiquitous national symbol. So here it's reproducing the Statue of Liberty, but as you can see, we only have a small piece of the Statue of Liberty. I have here the big Statue of Liberty, so we can see, I think this is probably right here. We have the detail of the robes here. So Jan Vo is a Vietnamese-born artist his family flees South Vietnam and immigrates to Denmark when he was 4. And he now lives and works in Berlin and Mexico City. And for We the People, the artist hired workers in Shanghai to create a 1-to-1 replica, so an exact scale replica of the Statue of Liberty in about 300 different pieces. But the pieces have never been assembled into a whole, and instead they're dispersed throughout the world. So, the fragments went to, I think, 15 different countries originally. And Jan Vo had actually never seen the Statue of Liberty before making this piece, but he was fascinated by it. And he was fascinated by the way that it was made and put together. And this piece is on view at the Rose, and I invite all of you to come see it when the Rose reopens on August 3rd, because it really is so cool to see in person, because it really lets you engage with the Statue of Liberty in a very intimate, human way that you can't really engage with the original, because people are down here. And, this allows you to really get kind of up close and personal with it. And, it's asking us to grapple with the implications of its production, of its fragmentation. It's asking us to think about global capitalism and colonialism and how American ideals are spread through the world. And the original Frederick Auguste Bartholdi depiction of Libertas, the Roman goddess of liberty, was created by French workers. And Vo's replica was fabricated in Shanghai using the exact same techniques. And so when you get up close and see this piece, you can see how thin the copper material is. It's about 2.4 millimeters, which is about the depth of 2 pennies. So in some ways, it's calling, attention to the fragility of this promise of freedom. But I think it's also calling attention to our ability to bend and shape it. The workers hammered the copper around an armature in this technique called repoussé. And so I think of it maybe as this call to action, kind of telling us to get to work, telling us that we can mold and shape our societies globally. And, we can bend them to fit with our ideals. So Raj, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts on this piece.
Well, I really like your interpretation. It's not just the depth of the material you mentioned and the rustic color of copper. You might think it evokes this kind of antiquity, that this Project of Liberty is aging, but the fact that it's transportable, that it has this global kind of consumptive quality, that the experience of liberty for an immigrant can be shared across places, especially those still fighting for democracies or hoping one day that they'll have democracies. But getting back to the specificity of the context here, the full-bodied Statue of Liberty as a symbol, but also as just the actual embodiment of it. Who's had that privilege of full embodiment? Because if you think about it from an intersectionality standpoint, that all of us have been minoritized one way or another, and especially multiply minoritized across various variables. If we're talking about people of color, we're talking about queer people, we're talking about queer people with a disability. We're fragmentary vis-a-vis the whole, which would be the white, cis, male, heteronormative structure of power that's been in place since colonization and slavery to now. So we're always fragmentary. And so our perspective into liberty in some respects is fragmentary too, but we're fully embodied in a way that we're trying to narrate against this fragmentary construction. And I'm struck by another principle that comes out of critical race theory in the early 90s is this notion of whiteness as property. And you might think, what does that mean? It's not just that we are beholden to this notion of white being a valued commodity, which it is, still is, but it's the ability for whiteness to objectify everything else as a form of property from slavery to now. And therefore, property is disposable. So I wonder about coming back to this issue of objectification and embodiment and the fragmentary quality of it, that do we have a conception here where this may be hard to take, because if you are fully embodied and able-bodied and racially embodied as white and cisgendered male embodied and part of the heteronormative structure of power, if you can check off all the boxes of privilege there, the rest of us, one way or another, have to overcome this pessimism, optimism, superiority, inferiority dialectic that afflicts us, and embrace our own kind of embodiment for what it is.
Interesting. I love that. Okay, well, we have about 5 minutes left, and I'm wondering if there are any questions from our audience. You can put questions in the chat, or we have a Q&A feature, because I feel like we've talked about a lot of really interesting questions, and there's a lot there. And much of it is very, I feel, fraught for us still. So I'm wondering if anybody has any comments or questions that they want to share. I know it's lunchtime, and everybody, I'm so happy that so many people came out to engage with us in this dialogue. So I'd love to hear from people. And Raj, in the meantime, I don't know if you have any sum up thoughts.
I do, but here we have a question. Let's see.
Are you familiar with the work of Sonia Clarke and how her work with flags relate to this topic? I am. It's interesting, when I put this together, there were originally I had probably 3 times as many pieces in this show. And the work of flags is just, it could be probably an entire exhibition just about this, but yeah, there are so many. I would have loved to have included Sonia Clarke in this talk. There are so many people that I would have loved to include. But yeah, also Sonia Clarke, I think, does a lot of work around the Confederate flag too, which is a whole other, and we just had a lecture last night with Barclay Hendricks, which he also has some stunning pieces around, that's a whole other topic about how the Confederate flag can be used in art. But yeah, maybe we'll have to do a part 2 next year and include some of the other artists that we didn't get to talk about. But sounds like, we're getting some nice comments that people enjoyed the topic. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. And, I really hope everyone will be able to come visit the Rose soon, see some of these pieces in person. And I want to let everyone know that our next exhibition is Argivan Khosravi, Black Rain, which opens on August 3rd. And the work in that exhibition is really extraordinary and stunning. So please look out for more information about that exhibition and programming. And thank you so much, Raj, for joining me today. It was such a treat to get to talk to you about some of this stuff. And I really appreciate your insights and context.
And Madeleine, thank you for the perspective and insights you brought. I learned so much from trying to understand the genesis of the works and then what the legacy is. But maybe in closing, if I can make one remark, people might ask, are we optimistic about the full realization of equality and liberty in a diverse society, in a diverse democracy, or are we going to be pessimistic? Because they're also what are called passive optimists, which means I think everybody for the most part is on board with equality and liberty, but are we going to do anything about it? And I think the artists are showing great courage and conviction in trying to meet those highest patriotic ideals. But the paradox is that maybe the highest form of patriotism is the final freedom that we could all have, which is to fundamentally question our place in society, especially those of us that are minoritized or among the oppressed.
Well, with that, I think we'll say thank you. That's a great closing thoughts. And thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeleine.
Bye.